Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a weekly wrap up. So 5 books in all. Citizen, an American lyric by Claudia Rankine. Plainwater by Carson. The long listed for the Man Booker International, The Discomfort of Evening by Marieke Rijneveld. A Run in the Park by David. Oh, A Run in the Park by David Park. I've only just twigged that. A Run in the Park by David Park, but it's not about him. And finally, Why I've Not Written Any of My Books by Marcel Benabou. Okay, so I'm going to start with the Rankine. It is described as poetry, but it's definitely free verse if it is. And it's about race in America. Rankine herself was born in Jamaica, but is an American citizen, and it's very, very strong. There's a supremely good section on Serena Williams being a sort of all-conquering tennis star, but how her colour occasionally got her into hot water through no fault of her own with the authorities. So in Wimbledon, you're only allowed to wear white. It's the last sort of tournament that won't allow you any colour. And of course, Serena, this didn't actually happen at Wimbledon, this happened on the circuit at a major tournament. Serena Williams was called for an imaginary foot fault that cost her the match. And it's that sort of brilliant symbol of, you know, a white-clad player of coloured skin, and her foot is perceived to be across the white line, hence the foot fault. And it's symbolic of, you know, she sort of gate crashed the white person's bourgeois party that tennis is by beating all and sundry. And occasionally the authorities buck a rankle and pull her back with some very, very dubious umpire calls. And it's supremely good on that. And it leads to the wider theme of this book it's both about visibility of different colour skin, but also invisibility. So the visibility is someone like Serena, as I say, who gate crashes, you know, the Whites' Tea Party, and she sort of, they try and sort of kick back and marginalise her and really render her invisible, unsuccessfully in her case, because she is so dominant in her sport. But the opposite is when, you know, you just want to blend in on public transport or whatever, you know, to be invisible, but the colour of your skin is picked up on in comments, or someone gets up and, you know, they're sat next to you and they get up to move away from you, that kind of thing. So where your desire for visibility is quashed because it's made all too invisible by slight and insult. So, you know, this was a really good book, and I gave it 4 out of 5. Next on to Carson, Plainwater. So this is my second Carson ever, and the second this year, and I've become an Carson fanboy. There's just no getting away from this. I love her. I just love the way her mind is portrayed on, you know, on the pages, in all these different genres of writing, such as poetry, such as essays, you know, all different sort of styles, and it's, you know, it's not always possible to see how it all hangs together as a piece, but I don't think that matters. For me, the reaction I have when I'm reading this is it gets my synapses firing. There's just so much rich association I draw from this book. So it starts off with fragments of an ancient Greek poet called, who I definitely have to look this up, Mimnermos. So we only have fragments of his poetry, like we only have fragments of Sappho, who is very central to Carson's work. And it starts off with Carson sort of riffing, sort of short sort of verse responses to these fragments. And then the next section is a modern day interview with this poet, as if he was alive in the 21st century. Then we have one of my favourite sections, which is called Canicula di Anna, which is a conference of phenomenologists who are meeting in an Italian town called Perugia, and Carson considers quite an old painter from that region, from Perugia, called Venucci. And all these 3 elements of phenomenology, of the philosophy of that, is blended together with this poet, this painter, is blended together with the fact that Perugia was a besieged city, and the citizens built a sort of an inner city inside their city while it was under siege. But in the end, even that was penetrated, and they were expelled and exiled. And all those elements are blended together so richly, feeding off each other, firing off one another. And then there was a section called The Life of Towns, which was sort of short poetry on different types of towns. It reminded me a bit of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, but I have to say Invisible Cities is a lot more richer. I didn't get a lot out of this section, but then we come on to the main heart of the book, which is called The Anthropology of Water, and just blew my mind really. So one section, a long section of that, is a sort of a modern day pilgrimage to or I should say a pilgrimage recreating a historical pilgrimage to a cathedral in Spain that I assume Carson undertook as a young woman, and it's about sort of finding your inner self, your relationship to life and God and reality, and of course it's a very, very difficult physical challenge. It's walking basically across half of Spain, and then interestingly, once they've reached the cathedral, then they carry on, although in a car. So the religious and spiritual aspect of the pilgrimage is over. They hire a car and they go to Finisterre, which is the sort of most western bit of land, although it's an island off western Spain. Before then you're in the Atlantic. There's nothing else until you hit America, and because it lacks the spiritual dimension, and Finisterre itself is sort of shrouded in mist and bland and disappointing. It's like the pilgrimage has run out of gas. It's almost like that film Two Lane Blacktop, in which the road, it's a road movie, but it ends with the celluloid sort of catching on fire and burning up. Because there's nothing else to say about it, and that was very similar. But then the next sort of largest section in this is a modern day pilgrimage, which is a road trip across America that Anne Carson undertakes with her then husband. I don't know if she's still married to him or whatever, who is sort of well versed in Chinese art, classical Chinese art. And again, you get these blending of elements. And it's basically looking at the difference between men and women, which Carson is asking herself, through the fact that this man and this woman are living under canvas at night, they're driving on the road, the different skills and talents, such as, men are supposed to be good map readers and women aren't supposed to be good map readers, but also to different ways of perceiving and just how we view the world, really. And it's brilliant, and I love the contrast of those two pilgrimages, a sort of a traditional religious pilgrimage and the sort of modern day American pilgrimage, which is just a road trip across the continent. I just thought it was fantastic. And the other element in the American road trip is Carson is also sort of throwing in her memories about her dad and his Alzheimer's, and it's just there are beautiful sort of small snippets about that. So, for example, when she was a child, her dad and her went to cut down a Christmas tree on Christmas Eve and bring it back, and the father would never let her touch the saw because it was deemed as too dangerous, and he would do all the cutting, but then the two of them would drag the tree back. And when her father is in his first year of Alzheimer's, she alone goes to cut down the tree because she's always felt perfectly capable of doing this. And she brings it back and she catches his eye with the tree, and she's fearing that he's just going to go mad because this is a sort of statement of his emasculation and his withering sort of being. But his answer is very, very quiet, and it is: he looked at the tree and saw the axe. It was something perfectly quiet. I didn't think you could do that, he said, perfectly quiet. His hands hanging down, the tiny ticking kitchen, the snow-dark morning. It was draining from him to me. I had killed him. And I just think that's beautiful, tragic and beautiful. So 5 stars. I can't get enough of Anne Carson. Whether I read a third this year or not remains to be seen. I don't have any in my to-be-read pile, and at the moment I'm not asking Amazon delivery people to deliver because I don't want them exposed any more than they have to be. Maybe I could go and do it through an indie bookshop. I don't know. on to The Discomfort of Evening by Marieke Lucas Rijneveld, who identifies as they. When I started this book, I thought it was going to, there were two negatives against it. One, it's narrated by a child, which very rarely works for me, and I'll post a link to my video on what I have against child narrators. And the other is it's a purely rural setting on a farm, which, as an urbanite, I have very, very little interest in. But as I started this book, it very quickly overcame both of those. The child's voice worked in a way that reminded me quite similarly of the book The Soldier Repairs the Gramophone by a Bosnian writer whose name I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll caption it. In that, because of the strange logic and association and sort of half understood, half grasped sort of understanding of realities, these are sort of jammed together where they don't normally fit. It's like doing a jigsaw without taking care that you're always putting the right piece in. And that was in that book, and it's in this book, and I thought it worked very well. And part of the understanding is that there's a mixture of quite severe religiosity that her parents, it is a girl who's the narrator here, that her parents put upon her. Her own observations about life and death on the farm of animals, both natural death, but also obviously, culling of animals for food. And there's a lot about sort of insects and mould and all this sort of, the nasty, gritty, dirty side of life. So all these sort of things come together, are brought together as her understanding, her trying to make sense of the world. And what she's trying to make sense of, as are all the family, is that an older brother dies in a ice skating accident when the ice breaks and he either drowns or dies of hypothermia. And the family never really recover from that. The mother basically stops eating and stops caring. The father is sort of getting more and more irascible and sort of less attentive to his children and attentive to the farm. And in the end, it's struck by foot and mouth disease, and that sort of wipes out all of their livestock at a go as they have to be culled. And her remaining brother and her younger sister, and there's a lot about sex and violence that they're basically recreating by taking what they viewed from the animal kingdom on the farm, but also they have this sort of strange, what's the word? Sort of mythology they've built up that the way to sort of bring their parents back into life, as it were, is that they have to get them what they call mating again. They have to recreate another son to replace the one that died, and if they're able to do this, that the family will be saved. And the children are sort of enacting lots of very strange rituals, both with sort of animals like frogs and toads, but also with each other. So in that sense, I felt the use of the rural setting was really, really good. But I have to say, after about 100 pages of this, it didn't change. It was just more of the same, more of the same. Yes, there were sort of slight motions of the parents sort of taking their journeys that they were going on, and also the main character, but it didn't really go anywhere, and until the very end, which I just didn't believe at all. But there is a lot to recommend this book. I give it 4 out of 5 because I did enjoy the writing. So I didn't think the book as a whole was fantastic, but there's so many good bits of writing. It's worth saying that this author is a poet. This is her first book, and I wouldn't say it was lyrical, but it was so image rich. That's what I really liked about her, about this writing. So just to give you a couple of examples. So her brother Obi has said, "God damn it," which of course is the most cardinal sin you can have in their religion. "If Dad hears that," she says, "there's sleep in the corners of her eyes. I could wipe it away with my little finger, the way Obi and I once got a snail out of its shell with a filling knife and smeared the slimy creature onto the tiles." So that's what I mean by example of using what's around them. The snail. So she's brushing sleep away from her eye, but the image that she uses is when they cut open a snail, which is a brutal, mindless act really, and then just smearing it, its insides on the tiles. It's just so sort of casually brutal. which sets the tone for this novel. So her dad's come back in and is annoyed that his coffee isn't on the table. What I need is a bit more respect. He strides back through the door, slamming it behind him. Anger has hinges that need oiling. So again, it's that childlike imagination where she's associated the slamming of the door as representative of anger, which it is. But she sort of says, because the door is sort of rusty and the hinges sort of squeak as well, that anger is, needs hinges that need oiling. Again, I just thought there was a lot of really good writing in here, so I gave it 4 out of 5. So David Park, A Run in the Park. So last year I read my first David Park book, which is called Travelling in a Strange Land, and was impressed enough that it actually crept into the lower echelons of my top 10 reads of the year last year. This is his next book, and the strengths of Travelling in a Strange Land could not be recreated in here because it's so slight. It's a 99-page book. And what I really liked about Travelling in a Strange Land was his use of imagery, how he layers it so they keep sort of coming back and moving your understanding of these people on. Here, it's a group of people, each one individually is given their own sort of section, so it's much harder to have images that cut across. There was one instance of it, and I thought that was going to presage that these other images cut across these different characters, but it wasn't. And also, I didn't think the actual images that were evoked were as good as they were in Travelling in a Strange Land. So what the book is basically is there's a running group in Belfast called From Couch to 5K, where a trainer takes a motley group of people on runs 3 nights a week, building up gradually from walking to running, with the target being a 5K run at the end of it. And we get this group of people where we get an insight into 4 of them. One is Maurice, who is recently widowed. He's retired. He's obviously quite lonely, and he's worried about his daughter, who he thinks has married badly. Then we get Kathy, who her husband has walked out on her. She's had a recent health scare, hence her desire to get fit and healthy. And she has a daughter over the other side of the world in Australia, so she also is lonely. Then we get Brendan and I can't remember her name, Angela. Brendan and Angela, who are going to get married. One gets the sense they're in their sort of 30s, they're not young newlyweds. And they want to get fit and in shape for their wedding. And then we get Yana, who is a refugee from Syria and has spent her whole of her life in motion, running to avoid bombs, and has washed up in Belfast and is trying to help her family get on their feet, but there's a sense of sort of stasis that, so she's come to run to get, because that's the only sensation she feels comfortable with. And I have to say that Yana character is very typical of every time I read a Western writer's portrayal of a refugee from somewhere in the Middle East. It is unconvincing. It reads to me as how a Westerner would imagine it, not as an authentic experience of someone from that background. And she was the least convincing for me. And other than that, it sort of, it jogs along, to use a pun, quite nicely. It's unremarkable, and in a way David Park is an unremarkable writer. He writes about the unremarkable things of quotidian life, as does John McGregor. I prefer, I think, David Park to John McGregor, who's an author I don't really get on with at all. But I did feel that this was just too slight to achieve what he wanted. It's about slight lives, but it's nothing to sink your teeth into, really. So I gave this 3 out of 5. And finally, to Why I've Not Written Any of My Books by Marcel Benabou. I did struggle with this, I have to admit. Even though it should be absolutely right in my wheelhouse. It's by a French Aleppo writer, therefore you would say it's sort of on the experimental wing of writing. And it sort of when you see Why I've Not Written Any of My Books, my first thought was that it was non-fiction. But Mitchell Axler, who sent it to me, pointed out, no, it is fiction. But then my next thought was, maybe this is sort of that French thing of the death of the author. That's why even authors, they claim they write their books in that sort of structuralist analysis is no, they're only sort of products of their environment and culture and all this. Therefore, they're not, it's the culture that writes their books and the readers and critics who make the books by interpreting them. But it's not about that either. It is literally why he can't commit to sit down to write any books, even though this is obviously a fully published rendered book. And he sort of goes into detail about things like the history of all books has already been written, so where do you start? How do you choose between the different words that are on offer? The relationship of fiction to reality, trying to write reality or trying to really sort of, fictionalise it. The difficulty of beginnings, of, starting at random, which is, of course, what readers face when they open a book for the first time is, they are thrown into a seemingly random area until they get to understand the world that they've been invited into. And then we get a thing about the autobiographical nature of writing and how that can be self-indulgent. But if you successfully sort of take it away from your own life and expand it out and try to universalise it, then you create a sort of mythology about your life that doesn't exist. You sort of fictionalise your own life, but set up a myth about yourself. And the problem I had with this book, apart from the tone, because Thomas Bernhard's novel, Concrete, starts off with the same dilemma as a writer, and he's finding it really hard to sit down and get started. But Bernhard then pursues a novel full of energy and bravura and sort of insult and invective. This maintains quite a detached intellectual tone, which just didn't invite me in at all. And also, as I'm a writer, I've sort of cogitated on all the things that are in here and come to my own conclusions. And therefore I felt I didn't really get anything out of it. Now, a non-writer might really sort of get into this book and see it from a writer's point of view. But for me as a writer who sort of meditated on all this stuff myself, sometimes coming to the same conclusions, sometimes coming to different conclusions, but I didn't get anything new. So I felt a bit sort of blasé about this book, really. It didn't do a lot for me, so I gave it 2.5 stars. So there you have it. That's my weekly wrap-up. I'm going to start Lissa Evans' Our Finest. Lissa Evans, who wrote the book Old Baggage, which I read last year and also went into my top 10. This will be my second Evans book. I'm looking forward to it. And until then, thanks very much.